So this talk is called Enlightenment is Practice. Usually we hear practice is enlightenment, but I want to talk about it. So practice and enlightenment are two of the defining aspects of Soto Zen practice. And we often say that practice is enlightenment, that enlightenment is practice. But what do we mean by that? What do we really mean by that? Since a lot of the time it really doesn't feel that way, right? At least it hasn't for me. So today I'm going to explore this question through the lens of the second half of Dogen's proposition that enlightenment is practice. When I speak of it the other way, practice is enlightenment, I feel like it's almost like there's a practice of Zazen that we're kind of waiting around for it to feel like enlightenment, at least for myself. But when we put enlightenment first, enlightenment is practice, it points more directly towards our true nature, which we express through our practice. So to begin with, I'd like to take a look at the back story, the history of this idea, and then we'll turn it around and look at it in a more practical-ish type of way. So historically, the idea that enlightenment and practice are the same thing is not how it's been understood. It's a bit counterintuitive, and when you present this doctrine to someone from, say, the Theravada tradition, the tradition that's more common in South of Asia, you'll get met with some real skepticism at best. But there are very real historical and practical reasons for teaching the way that we do in Soto Zen. So traditionally, the way that enlightenment was conceived of was as a slow, steady destruction of what are called the kleshas, karmic defilements. And this is just a fancy name for all the unskillful habits that magnify our suffering, that sense that things aren't just quite right, and that if we could just get that one last thing, whatever it might be, that things would finally be all right. This is where that idea of a path towards enlightenment comes from. In the tradition, as written down in the Pali Canon, and even later on, there are various steps and stages and achievements that practitioners unlock progressively as they work their way steadily towards nirvana. This is still the view of our sister traditions that follow the Pali Canon closely. But early on in the history of Buddhism, a different conception of the path arose, the path towards enlightenment. And that path is the Bodhisattva path. This is based more on the Buddha's life as it's detailed in the Jataka tales. And these are the stories that are told about the Buddha and all the various lives that he led over millions of kalpas until he was finally reborn as Prince Siddhartha. So we're going to fast forward a little bit to when Buddhism entered China. This is probably 500 or 600 years after the Buddha lived. And it ran up against Taoism, which to the Chinese felt very, very similar to Buddhism, to the point where the idea sprang up that Lao Tzu, the author of the Tao Te Ching, the most famous Taoist text, had actually visited India and either was the Buddha or taught the Buddha everything he knew. And this started an arms race of fake sutras where Buddhism and Taoism, like Buddhists and Taoists, kept pushing back the date of the births of their founders back to like 1500 BC. It was a pretty wild time. But just to let you know that Lao Tzu is not the Buddha. Two completely different people. But back to the story. So when these two traditions met each other in China, it really did seem like they were both looking in a mirror. And so a great cross-pollination began where they started trading ideas and mutually influencing one another. One particular way that Taoism influenced Buddhism that has great ramifications for us in Zen is the idea of the Taoist sage. A Taoist sage would overcome the traumas of the world by simply returning to their true nature, a phrase that we still use in Zen today. The Taoist sage praised their own naturalness, believing that they already possessed everything that they needed in order to live a fulfilling life in accord with the great Tao. And all they needed to do was to turn their light around and look closely at themselves. It's starting to sound a little bit familiar. We recite something very similar to this in Dogen's Fukan Zazengi, his universal recommendations for seated meditation, when he writes, "Learn to take the backward step that turns the light around and shines it inward." He's betraying his Taoist roots there. So these ideas all started to naturally percolate together, and by about 400 or 500 CE, the Common Era, the doctrine of original enlightenment was developed. This is the idea that we are already enlightened fundamentally, and all we need to do is to figure out how to take that backward step and live in accord with our true nature, which is emptiness. It's empty. We are fundamentally empty, like space, like clean and clear, like the great sky itself. Nothing impedes our true nature. No unskillful practices, no karmic entanglements, nothing. All that gets in our way is our delusion. And even that is empty of its own nature. And once we've seen that our delusion isn't actually real, it simply falls away like a mirage of water on a distant highway. So this is the hotbed of discussion that Zen was born out of. Bodhidharma, the first patriarch of Zen, arrived on the scene about 100 years after the development of the doctrine of original enlightenment. And for the next 600 years or so, until Dogen arrived in 1224, these Chinese Zen practitioners worked with this idea of original enlightenment. If we're already enlightened and our fundamental delusion is really the problem, then how the heck can we transcend our delusion so that we can live according to our true nature? This is where all those crazy stories about Zen masters running around, slapping their students, talking in riddles and just generally acting as the contrarian come from. They're trying to figure this out. Their idea was that even words are delusion, so we need a way to practice that's free from their delusive influence. And since we're human beings, we can't actually get away from words so easily. They're also part of our nature, but we have to find a way to work with words that acknowledge their nature as delusion. But a project is also able to use them in the project of enlightenment. And so this whole hotbed that has developed over these couple of centuries is where Dogen Zenji enters the story. For Dogen, his big question is similar. It was, if we're already enlightened, then why do we need to practice at all? Shouldn't we just be enlightened already? And the answer to his question, as I've discussed before, is that practice is enlightenment. Enlightenment is practice. And unlike in some of our sister traditions, as I just mentioned, that see enlightenment as a stage that's worked towards and then achieved and then kind of static, Dogen saw enlightenment as he did not see it. He saw it as a constant state of practice. So this is especially true if we take the idea of no self seriously. If there's really no self, if there's nothing in us that isn't always changing, then there's nowhere for enlightenment to kind of stick to permanently. No permanent essence of enlightenment. And if that's true, then the only option we have is to constantly renew our enlightenment through practice. This is the skillful inverse of suffering. Since there's no self for suffering to stick to, the only reason why we're suffering is because we're continually practicing unskillful habits. When something happens that I don't like, I engage all my unskillful habits of body, speech, and mind, and either beat myself up over it, or blame myself for the situation, or just rant and rave, making myself feel miserable until the situation resolves itself, or it just simply ends of itself. So if instead we become acquainted with the Dharma, we learn how to practice it, and then we actually practice it in real time, we're able to recognize the situation that we're in. Listen to what our bodies and minds are saying, what they're saying to us, observe our karma, decide what the appropriate response is, and then actually employ it. That is a manifestation of practice as enlightenment, one manifestation of it. Sometimes we like to think, once I finally get enlightened, then everything's going to be all right, and then I won't have to put so much effort into things. But enlightenment is not a perpetual motion machine. It's like a bike. You have to pedal it, but also like a bike, the rest of the world does most of the work for you. You just have to pedal and steer. And often, we're simply able to coast, just flow with the Tao, so to speak. But like a bike, there also be hills, uphills and downhills. To blame the shape of the earth for the uphills because you have to work so hard with it, or to praise the downhills because it's going so easy, right? I'm just doing great, is delusion. To simply observe the shape of the earth, the shape of your life, to pedal when we're going uphill and to coast while we're going downhill, that is also an active manifestation of enlightenment as practice, practice as enlightenment. So that's it for the history of the idea of practice as enlightenment. I'd like to get a little bit more in the weeds and talk about how we can practice this teaching more specifically and the ideas behind it. So it's all well and good to say that practice is enlightenment. Enlightenment is practice, but like I mentioned, we all know that it's not often how we experience it. I know for me. I know I've talked about it before, but when I finally started sitting Zazen, I'd be sitting there with my legs aching, staring at the wall, just going like, is this enlightenment? Oh, I don't feel enlightened. I feel pretty much the same, or maybe like a little bit calmer, which is nice, but I don't, what does a Buddha feel like? So, allow me to explain a little more fully what Dogen means with some koans. It's a little koan here. So, a monk once asked our Dharma ancestor Sakito Kizen, we chant in our lineage, what is liberation? What's enlightenment? How do we free ourselves from dukkha, from suffering and dissatisfaction? How do we see our true nature? And if we're looking through a Soto lens, you can even ask, how is enlightenment practice? And Sakito replied, who bound you? I'm not sure if that's the answer that the monk was looking for. How do I get free myself? Who locked you up? I don't know if that makes sense, but since it's a koan, I don't know if it needs to make sense. But let me put another story to illustrate that illustration. So if we come across a guy who's sitting in a room with a locked door in front of him and a completely wide open door behind him, and he calls out for a key, we might say, you don't need a key, right? I reject the premise of your request. And even though it might make more sense to tell him, just turn around and boom, he'd be free, it often doesn't work that way with our minds, right? Although, as I've said, we do give the same advice in Soto, turn around. You've created this room by splitting up this undifferentiated world into little pieces, picking up the ones that you like and ignoring the ones that you don't. Now, the real conundrum is that in this situation, we're both people. We're the guy in the room and we're the guy outside of the room. We split ourselves in two often, subject, object. And what's even more, we're also the room. And we're all three of these figures. We're the guy inside the room, the guy outside the room, and we're the room ourselves. We tend to I'm going to pick which of the three that I like, and that's just me. Everything else I can just ignore, I can push away, or I can try to grab and pull in if I really like it and I think that I need it to make myself feel better. So how do we get out of this situation? How do we actually free ourselves? So we sit in our rooms, metaphorically, our backs to an open door, but with the Dharma and the Sangha and the Buddha as our guides, we're able to see that we're splitting the world up in this way. And with our practice of Zazen, we're able to locate these doors, sense the shape of the room, literally and metaphorically, and then just let it all kind of collapse. Let impermanence, which is always happening anyway, do its thing. We create these rooms and these doors by holding on, pushing away and ignoring everything in our lives. If we just opened our hands, the hand of thoughts, these buildings that we've created will just kind of collapse under their own weight. That's the prescription. But our practice, the important part of the practice that I'm talking about here is the just part. Just sitting, just walking, just living our lives, just observing. This just transcends all of this, both enlightenment and delusion. When we're just sitting, just living, just observing, we're no longer chopping up the world into these little pieces. And when we're truly practicing, it's often not even a conscious decision, not building these walls, not sitting in an empty room, not building the locked doors of the mind, not doing this rises up organically from our true nature, since we already live in a world that's empty, clear, and spacious like the open sky. Sometimes great awakening appears while practicing this way, and other times great delusion occurs, and most of the time we're somewhere in between. But during all of that, we simply just sit and observe. The observing encompasses both. It's skillful to see into our own emptiness, to see into our own delusion, to wake up brightly. But even when we're in a deep, dark pit of suffering, our practice takes the same shape. We simply observe. Not to push thoughts and feelings away, not to cling on to them, and not to ignore them. From delusion to enlightenment, back to delusion, and back to enlightenment. This thread, this practice is clear. Pay attention before enlightenment, pay attention after enlightenment, pay attention through enlightenment. But if you're not paying attention, you'll miss your true nature, even though it's always right here. So often the question occurs in all of this, is Kensho important? Seeing into your true nature? Yes, but this nature reveals itself naturally through practice, through steady, unwavering attention, through the ups and downs of life. So we just watch. And it's not only our true nature that's revealed through practice, but the substance of our own lives. If we're not paying attention, if we're living in our thoughts about our lives and not actually living our lives, then we're truly living in a ghost cave in delusion. This is what Dogen's trying to say in Fukan Zazengi, where he writes, in surveying the past, we find transcendence of both mundane and sacred, and dying while either sitting or standing have all depended entirely on the power of Zazen. Zazen is giving us our lives back, the wholeness of our lives, not this life that's chopped up into 1,000 little pieces, and we like the one side of it, but we don't like the other. Zazen just takes it all in, and we just look at it. So, in our practice, we often focus solely on the mind aspect of the word shin, and not on the heart's aspect. So we have this word in Zen practice, shin, or shin, which means heart-mind. We translate that word as heart-mind for a reason. Both sides, heart and mind. We also often focus on the mental part of enlightenment to the exclusion of the emotional part. For Dogen, there was no separation between them, between heart and mind and action. This is where I was confused for all those years. As I sat on the mat trying to figure out if this sitting thing, this Zazen thing, was actually enlightenment or not. This is what the Western world and our Western Buddhism often forgets, or maybe never even knew in the first place. I figured it out, that you can be greatly enlightened through the heart long before your mind catches on. I'm sure you've met these people, right? Bodhisattvas who don't even know that they're bodhisattvas, like the guy from the Lotus Sutra, who doesn't even know, or who has that priceless jewel sewn into his robe. He's a rich man, and he doesn't even know it, but he is actually rich because he has this jewel. Dogen takes us even further by teaching that if we wholeheartedly, and that's the key, if we wholeheartedly practice, we sit on a cushion in order to save all beings, if we live with the truth of impermanence, if we practice the precepts, also important, then our enlightenment is real, it's manifest. Maybe it's still just a jewel sewn into our clothing, but one day if we pay attention close enough, we'll find it. Then we'll know that we're rich instead of just being rich. Dogen would rather call that, that sweet woman down the street who feeds all the neighborhood cats out of her overflowing compassion for their well-being, but who's never stepped a foot inside of the Zen temple. He'd rather call her truly enlightened, that's enlightened through deeds and heart, than 1,000 Zen masters who've clearly seen into the emptiness of their own nature, but who then turn around and wreak havoc in the lives of everybody they encounter. Dogen does not consider that enlightened. Right? Not only because our actions betray our minds, but because there's no separation between minds and actions. They're the same. So if there can be said to be a point to enlightenment, it's to, this is a complicated sentence. If there can be said to be a point to enlightenment, it's to really show us that these walls that we construct mentally are fake, right? They're not real. So if we already live a life without walls, what need is there to also know that we're living a life without walls? And if we have the experience that there are truly no walls, but we continue to live a life of walls, the initial experience of no walls is basically just an accolade. It's sitting there up on your shelf, gathering dust. To sow acrimony everywhere you go, whether ill-intentioned or well-intentioned somehow, often actually, now I think about it, betrays a mind of delusion at best, no matter what spiritual accomplishments you have under your belt. So even when we're sitting there with monkey mind, completely swinging from branch to branch in confusion, when we truly sit earnestly, fully committed to upright sitting with the wish to save all beings, our actions aligned with the Buddhas and ancestors, that's enlightenment as well. That's the timeless expression of Zazen as our lives. Not practice imposed from the outside, but practice naturally arising from our very nature. So practice well, practice deeply, and pay attention because your life depends on it. Thank you. Okay, close this guy out. Do you want to lead it or you want? Oh, I'm sorry. I got it. We still have time. I'm so used to we're rushing to the end and having no time. Question. Does anybody have questions? I got a little worked up on this one. This one talking about rising out of this thing just came out of my brain, just in a 3 hour, I think it's 3 hour mammoth session of just typing away. I'll just type some notes and 3 hours later, the whole thing's done. I'm like, whoa, it's like channeling from the bodhisattvas in the past or something like that. But it's
enlightened.
Yeah,
it was so good.
Thank you.
Yeah. Enjoyed it.
You have a question?
Shinkyu, thank you.
Yeah.
And I liked the statement about living life with no walls. The walls thing.
Yes.
To try to walk through life as if there isn't walls, but we live in a world where maybe we construct them, even though they're really them being there is sort of an illusion. So, to you, what does that mean in a relationship context? Because we interact with other people. So is that when we put up walls of defense, or maybe think we have to act differently around different people, or that kind of thing? Could you speak on that?
Well, sometimes you do. Sometimes walls are real. They're real enough. You could walk into it and hurt yourself.
Break your nose.
You could walk. It's true. You walk into a glass door. I see the bugs bumping on the wood glass sometimes. Yeah. I could tell you about building walls and relationships in the past. A lot of it comes from karma, really. At least for me, the way that I looked at it, it really bubbled up from my, my family situation, and then the karma that I received from my parents, they received from their parents, going all the way back. So when you don't know that the walls that aren't walls are not real, they are real. Well, that's kind of the thing that the Buddha talks about. If you don't understand that you're living in delusion, then these delusions are real, and you can't break that. You can't break that wall down. Whatever wall you throw up in a relationship between people. I think for us, it's really about, in Zazen, looking at what walls are out there and dealing with them skillfully. Because you can have a conversation with, I don't know, your friend who's like 50. You wouldn't have the same conversation with like an 8-year-old, and you just can't. So there are walls that have to exist in some sense, but it's like, would you, like what? Yeah. I guess you'd have to really look. Yeah, it just comes back to looking, like what type of conversations or walls would be necessary. Sometimes I know people that have rather bad relationships with their parents, to say the least, and they have to put walls up. Those walls will save their lives. But if you take those walls and you put up in your home with your parents that are abusive or whatever, and you take that around with you in the rest of the world, you're going to cause yourself a lot of unnecessary stress. So really hard, no hard yes or no question. Just what's your relationship to the walls that you put up and that are out there already? That's what I'm really talking about. I don't know if that answered your question at all. No,
Maybe
maybe.
part
I don't know if there's really an answer.
So part of that, in terms of practice, is examining these different aspects of our own karma, our habit energies, and figuring out, where do they come from? Are they useful? Maybe that sort of thing. And I mean, myself, to move on to, question. A lot of times in meditation, I feel like that person in the room, sitting with the back to the door, and not being able to access the person up here who's, saying, the door's behind you, and not, not feeling my relationship to the walls either, And I don't know if it's, the idea of words is really interesting to explore, because I basically live by words, career in words, etc., etc. And I find when I try to sit without words, that it's better for me, but it's really hard not to think and practice in a cloud of words. I don't know. Any tips?
I get to say, well, lately I've had issues with monkey mind for a while here. I've just been going back to the breath. I start my I'm always changing, I'm always tweaking Zazen. It's never the same thing. That's one thing you learn from Zazen. It's always different. You could sit down between 3 sits on, like on a Sunday, just sitting. First sit, one thing. Second sit, 180 degrees different. Third sit, and like another 180 degrees in another direction. So I've lately just been count 1 to 10, 3 times at the start of my sit. Now it's just really get into it. And every time I find myself, following that trail of words, I just count 1 to 10 again, just over and over. I'm just seeing what that does. I don't know if that's a real answer, but always constantly tweaking the practice. Zazen is one thing, but what it is just not holding on, it's not grasping, not pushing away, not ignoring. So inside of that scaffolding or that structure, you have an infinite amount of possibilities for dealing with what's going to come up in your practice. So just try different stuff. Try following that breath. If that doesn't work, sometimes just indulge in the words that are there one time. Maybe another one, whatever infamously said, crush mind with mind. No words. Do that one sit. See how that works. Really stir it up and see what happens.
Back to basics.
Or try some crazy new thing. I recommend always experimenting with, because we're little scientists of our lives in Zazen. Spice it up within the context of Zazen. That's what I've done for most of my practice. No one would ever tell me don't do that. Not that I would listen if they told me. Like, this is my brain. This is my body, mind. I can do what I want with it. No one can tell me nothing. I think that the container of Zazen is very good, but yeah, within that, our responsiveness to it is unlimited. Don't let it get stale. Shake it up sometimes. Yes.
I have a question about sort of having like an achievement orientation around it. It feels like if enlightenment is practice, something that happens to me a lot is if I feel like I am practicing it correctly or doing it poorly, then I am moving further away from enlightenment. And I know in the back of my head that like the self that is like even evaluating my performance is like pulling me further away, but I really have trouble shutting it up. Like this is not the concentration that you're going for. You can do better than this. What does it work around for that, or is there what helps with that? I suppose is my question.
What is it, or what you're looking to figure out how to stop that mind?
Yeah, so stop like grading myself, and more just focus and not think about me focusing.
Well, we can just concentrate on that mind that is grading. We're not trying to get rid of it. You're not trying to keep it. You're not trying to ignore it. That's all you're left with, is just watching it. It's when you're feeding it attention. Even if you're feeding it negative attention, I'm trying not to do this. You're feeding it. You just kind of let it do it. It's like a little kid. He'll eventually run himself. If he's running around like a crazy person, he'll eventually run out of energy. It might be longer than you want. You might realize that you thought you gave him crackers and it was like a candy bar, and you're listening to him loud there for a while. But it's more about, this is what Nonan said. Zazen is not about achieving a particular state of mind. It's a process. It's a method. Just look at that part of your brain that's saying, we're not doing very good. Or, why are we doing great? Why isn't it like it was last time? Why is it hard? You just look, and then when you do that, you start, after a long enough time, you start kind of realizing, like, I've been grading myself my entire life. Who started that? I don't know for you, but for me, it would have probably been parents. They're, oh, my parents were, why did I do that? Oh, because I wanted them to love me. Okay, it's criteria. Well, how did they get this way? I'm not saying this is your story, but this is well, their parents probably, maybe they were poor. They worked their way out of being poor. They instilled this particular values into it. So listen, you start realizing these things as you start really listening to what your mind is saying. Then you're like, wow, is this doing me any good right now? Maybe it is. Maybe it's not. Maybe in this instance it isn't, but later on in the day it is. Really looking at what our relationship is to whatever arises in the mind. It's not so much the content, but we're trying to figure out how we relate to what it is that we are. So just kind of, and you're probably like, crush it. Just crush it. at it and look at why it's happening, and just trace that back, see where it came from, and it comes from the entire universe. Not to give you the answer on the test, but it's made of so much stuff, but just look at it, investigate. That's the big part. Yeah. Thank you.